Hello, my name is Chris Perry and I teach history. The question gets asked of me often, how is it, Professor, since you're so smart, that the South, the Confederacy, is defeated soundly in the Civil War, but then comes back later with this idea of Jim Crow and the things that go on in the South afterwards? How do they do that? How are they allowed to do that? Should they have been allowed to do that? This is the question that pops up. As a matter of fact, my wife even asked me that question recently, and we had a long discussion, and she suggested that I should do a video on this, so that's why I'm here. So, Jim Crow, what is it? Well, it's based on a minstrel show caricature of the happy slave. Okay, so slavery was a happy thing, which you can imagine, or at least in our modern sensibilities, we understand that slavery was not a happy thing by any stretch of the imagination. You cannot make the practice of slavery a good thing. It's just not possible. You can't do it. Now, but this visual of a different type of Old South, right? This is where the Jim Crow comes from, right? It's kind of a revisionist history is really what it boils down to. But Jim Crow gets to symbolize an entire system in the South that takes place roughly after 1876, even through the Civil Rights Movement. Now, you start to get civil rights legislation in the 60s that starts to sort of change some things, but that's not what this is about. Anyway, Jim Crow itself. How did it get there, and what's the point here? Now, number one, before we even get to this, Reconstruction was one of those things that was not necessarily successful. I mean, you have a moment, a brief moment of African-American empowerment after the Civil War. It's very brief, because in the South, you start to have African-Americans that are in positions of power. They actually get elected to office, and there is a brief moment, right, during the Grant administration, where you sort of have this going on. Now, there's also some bad things going on too, but at least it's a moment there. You go from the institution of slavery being there to you actually have African Americans in positions of power. Now, so Reconstruction can be considered a success and a failure. A success because the Union came back together, but a failure because it didn't properly address the issues that came out of the Civil War. It just didn't do it. Some of this had to do with Abraham Lincoln being assassinated and Andrew Johnson, who was just not a good guy, taking over, but it is what it is. Now, in the South, as far as Jim Crow, when it really kicks off and when things really start to change, it was the election of 1876. Now, this one, if you think that 2016 was bad, 1876 was pretty rough. You had Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel J. Tilden. Now, Tilden, by all accounts, should have won this election. He had the popular vote. He really even had the Electoral College, but some things got held up in the South, different states. There was some interesting discussions about this isn't fair, this isn't fair. So what it boils down to, in a nutshell, is an event called the Compromise of 1877. So all these people get together in a room. You've got the Democrats and you've got the Republicans. We need to decide what goes on. Now, the Democratic Party at this time was the party of white supremacy. Some people seem to think that we historians never mention that, but we do all the time. I mean, I talk about it constantly. The Democratic Party was definitely, without a doubt, the party of white supremacy during this time frame. There is no question about that. That's not up for debate. But as we know later on, how party ideologies, they will shift and change during the Great Depression, and then the New Deal comes in. Some people, maybe more conservative people, look at Roosevelt and they say, that looks a lot like socialism. I don't know that I like that. You start to see kind of a shift. Then after World War II, you see more of a shift. You've got this fight against communism. Communism is seen as a force that you need to destroy. And on the other side, you have the Beat Generation. Then you have what's going to turn into the counterculture of the 60s. And you start to have a more defined conservative and liberal party system in the United States. It's just as party starts to realign, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, but this is how this works. Also, you have African Americans will shift. They go from being Republicans to Democrats later on. But anyway, don't want to get ahead of that. But the Democratic Party at this time is the party of white supremacy. Okay, now, what happens is the Democratic Party tells the Republicans, you really want the White House? We'll give it to you. It's yours. We don't want it, but we want the South. So why don't you take the military, who's been here for a while, and leave? Just go on, take off, and we'll take over right here. We got it. So the Republicans are like, well, all right. So Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president, but what happens after this deal is the same people that were in charge before and during the Civil War come back into power after. And this is where it really goes south. That's a pun. I didn't even mean to do it. All right, so how do they do this? That's the question. All right, so there are a few amendments that pop up. 13th Amendment pops up at the end of the Civil War, and then you have the 14th and 15th Amendment that comes later. Now, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution is said to abolish slavery in the United States. Period. That's what it says. Now, I always ask the question to my classes, did slavery truly end with the 13th Amendment? Which sounds like a no-brainer, right? No, it's not. Because technically there is a clause here in the 13th Amendment that does not apply to prisoners. So prisoners can be basically used as slave labor, for lack of a better term, and they are. Now today you hear a lot about mass incarceration, and if you've ever seen the Netflix documentary 13th, that is what they get into, which is definitely a valid topic and should be discussed a lot. That came out of the 1994 crime bill, and there's a lot of stuff going on with that now. But what I'm talking about is a practice called convict leasing. Now, this was a straight exploitative system. What happened was you would have mostly African-American males would be arrested by constables or people that maybe didn't have the type of police training that you would hope they would have. And you got to think of the time frame here, too. And they were working with the local businesses, the local leaders of the time who were white supremacists, also had a stake in certain industry. And what would happen is you have an entire generation, multiple generations actually, of mostly African-American males who were arrested and put to work in mines, put to work in mills, and things like that, right? Now, I know what you're thinking. You're saying, well, if they committed a crime, then they're prison, But most of these guys, as the research shows, most of these guys didn't do anything wrong. There was this whole idea of peonage, which peonage was you were going to pay off a debt, right? So these guys would walk into town, and the constable would see them, and they would go ask them a question, and they would say, hey, are you employed? And if they said no, they're a vagrant. Right? So they would be arrested immediately. If they happened to say yes, they would still arrest them, but then they would have to pay off this fine. Well, most of these gentlemen could not pay the fine, or at least these people didn't even care if they could. They ended up being put in mills and working, and so many people, untold amounts of people died in these mills and mines and different things, and it was just a horrible practice many people don't even know about. But this went on, and if you don't believe me, that's okay. You don't have to believe me. Check this book out. Do your research. There's another one by a guy named Matthew Mancini called One Dies, Get Another. It shows that convict leasing may have, and this is going to sound crazy to you, may have even been worse than slavery itself. How could that be? Well, as it turns out, slavery, chattel slavery, this was value to the slave owner, right? This was money. Now, this convict leasing didn't mean anything. A person, a life didn't mean anything because one dies, you get another, right? If you were a slave owner and you lost a slave, that would be hit you in the pocketbook and you wouldn't like that. But if you're one of these titans of industry or whatever, and you're using the slave labor in the South, you could just get another convict. And there's how it goes. But this is how, anyway, long story short, this is how the 13th Amendment was, there was a get around to it. Okay? All right, now, 14th Amendment. Now, this is citizenship for former slaves. This is the birthright citizenship. Now, the 14th Amendment does a lot of different things, but mainly for our purposes here, it has to do with citizenship, right? You are now citizens of the United States. If you remember the Dred versus Scott decision, Dred versus Scott actually said that African Americans could not be citizens of the United States. Terrible decision, but it is reversed by the 14th Amendment. But some more things start to happen. You have this Jim Crow system. You end up getting Plessy versus Ferguson, which says, oh, wait a minute, we can all be separate but equal, which is anything but. So if this restricts where a citizen of the United States can go or do because of this separate but equal, you get segregation, which becomes the norm in the South. So this is another way, right? Okay, so you got that. 15th Amendment, passed during the Grant administration. This allowed former slaves to vote. African-American males. Females are still not, sorry ladies, but they're messed up. You know, I think all women should do everything because they're awesome. But that's just me, I'm a feminist, right? All right, so the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. What this says is that all former slaves, African-Americans in the United States, can vote. And they're able to in the South originally. But then, once you have this group, they're referred to as the Redeemers, by the way. The Redeemers come in the South, and it's the same people that were in charge before. They say, hold on a minute. Now, I doubt very seriously that these African-American males are going to vote for us. And why should they, right? So, we need to restrict this. So, they start passing different things like a grandfather clause, right? The grandfather clause said, if your grandfather could vote, then you can too. And of course, this would go on forever because, of course, these African Americans, their grandfathers were not able to vote, and then they wouldn't be able to vote, and this would just continue to go. You see how that goes. There's also poll taxes that were unfair. There's also literacy tests that were rigged in a certain way. So this controls these rights that were given to African Americans right after the Civil War. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are controlled in the South. And this is how it worked. This was the way that they were able to use this Jim Crow system to basically run it like they wanted, and they did. That's basically, in a nutshell. There's a lot of things going on here. You get into a lot of racial violence that I'm not covering, right? Some terroristic type of ideas with the Ku Klux Klan. But this is, in a nutshell, removing rights from people that have obtained them. Bottom line, okay? All right, so that's how that works. So, then you get into, what about these monuments? This is the thing everybody wants to talk about right now, these monuments. What's the deal with them? Now, I'm not going to say one way or the other, you know, that's up to you to figure out, because it's there. The information is there, why they were put up, what's the point with them, and you know what type of problems they may cause. But I will point you in a direction. There's a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Now, if you've ever read some of these old Alabama textbooks, really old, some of you have seen them, some of you were in school when these things would go around. These old Alabama textbooks, Georgia textbooks, South Carolina, in the South, right? These old textbooks would paint a picture of how it was, the old South, right, before the Civil War. And this picture is just not right. I mean, let's just call it what it is. They call slavery this benign, happy institution, how they were having barbecues and the slaves would come in and it was all happy and we were all just, you know, it's myth-making is what it is. And you can make up your own decision on this. This is up to you. This is where critical thinking comes in, right? Read some of these old things. Find out what the United Daughters of the Confederacy did. Why did they put up these monuments? What was the point? You know, because this happened decades after the Civil War was over. This group came in and they, you know, put up monuments. They pretty much are behind the majority of the monuments that are put up. So why did they go up? That's your homework. You do that. You check that Now, another guy you can look at is a guy named Jubal Early. He's an interesting guy too. Check him out and some of the stuff that he wrote. So this is where critical thinking comes in. A lot of these things that go on today, if you just check them out, like with the monument thing. Now, what I will say about the monuments, regardless of the history that they are trying to portray is a little sketchy, I'll be honest, but in themselves, they are putting a type of history out there. So, so there is something to that. I wouldn't necessarily call it something that, we don't go stand at, when I teach, I don't go stand at monuments and say, hey, look at this. I just don't do that. So really, it kind of is what it is. But it does say something about society at that time. I will say that. But all these things is kind of up to you. This critical thinking, what's the point? What does all this mean? Ask yourself those questions. And then maybe you can come to an answer, right? Yeah. Anyway, that is Jim Crow. I've talked enough and I'm going to stop. So check those things out.